Founding myths? We don't need no stinking founding myths. Not in America. See, the way it works is that throughout history, significant institutions have been the result of fate or chance in one way or another. Right? And what's typically happened is that a stronger party has dominated a weaker party. And so that has caused there to come into existence these founding myths, right? And the reason why this happens is because an institution's virtue, right, is that it is acceptable to its members, or that it's attractive to its members. And so that's why these myths come about, right? Like, you're not actually going to have a society that's based on, like, oh, you know, our society sucks, right? You know, come join us, or be, you know, committed to our values. And in our case, you know, we have the historical founders of America, right? You know, I'm referring to the founding era at the end of the 18th century. And these men really exemplify what, you know, Plato and Aristotle refer to when they say that that the founding of a society is the highest opportunity for virtue, right? You know, the whole drama of Plato's Republic is about how, you know, being a founder is superior to being a king or a ruler. Much of the drama of that book is about that. So the reason we don't need a founding myth is because we can speak honestly about our founders. Right? My favorite Lincoln speech is his 1838 Lyceum speech. I call it his solid quarry speech. And he says there that the founders' accomplishments are, quote, not much to be wondered at, right? Because they had an advantage over, you know, his time and ours. And that is that for the founders, the crisis of their time unified all of the passions in society that ordinarily would have led to faction. So the founders had this advantage, right? The advantage of the unity of their passions. And, you know, this seems to disqualify the founders or be a criticism of them. But no, what I'm saying is they had an advantage. So just because they had that advantage doesn't mean that they don't serve as a fine example for us. Right? They're still a fine example, and we can still speak about them honestly, right? Because, you know, their situation is what caused them to do the right things at the right times. And now the founders were not great in every way. Don't get me wrong, but like I just said, they did the right things at the right times. Right? And, you know, I'm not just talking about the Revolution and the Declaration. And by the way, I have a video about the Declaration. It's called Prudence Indeed, or something like that. You can find it. My take on the Declaration. I'm especially talking about the Constitution, because, you know, the crisis continued through to then, and the founders, they deliberately met at a convention where they deliberated about the best form of government, and they came up with a system. They submitted it to society. Society accepted it. And, you know, more or less, we still have that system today, right? Hundreds of years later. Now, of course, it's getting less and less, and that's a problem. It's a crisis. Wink, wink. So, but here's really the point is that they deliberated about all these things throughout the founding era, but they were not utopian, right? The way I might put it is, that they danced with the devil by the pale moonlight, right? Or they chose the lesser among evils, right? They were committed to improvements, but without utopianism. And obviously, I'm referring to the compromises with slavery, right? Because if there hadn't been a union, it is quite unlikely that slavery would have met the same end, granted 2 generations later or so. But the fact of the union was very essential to the ending of slavery. I could speak more about that in another video. And I bring all this up because, the founders are gratuitously criticized. We got the Howard Zinn types, and they're criticized as like, oh, these conservatives, right? Conservative types, they believe in a mythical version of the founders, right? That's what I am responding to. I'm saying, no, we don't need no mythical version of the founders because we have the historical founders, right? They suffice. We can just speak about it honestly. It's not a big deal. And so what I want to suggest is that there is a new founding myth that is being, trying to be established and implemented in our society, right? And I'm referring to things like, for instance, the idea that, we should reject the founders because they were a bunch of self-interested bourgeois dillholes, right? Now, I do believe that there was a large amount of self-interest that motivated them. In general, I'm a critic of the Enlightenment, right? And we should be a critic of the Enlightenment. Let me make this point. The Enlightenment should be considered to be the noble lie of the bourgeois, right? It was a rationalization of bourgeois private property interests, right? So, I'm not saying that the founders didn't have a myth that you can find, for instance, in the Declaration of Independence. You should watch my video about that. But what I'm saying is that we can still embrace the historical founders and be honest about them and learn from them, and we should. And, saying that they are bourgeois, self-interested dillholes is not really a legitimate reason to reject them, right? But we have to call them these names because in so many ways they were superior to us, especially politically. And I mean, in terms of like political thought, political science, they were superior to us, right? But this new founding myth, the purpose of it is to recommend, something new. It's to recommend the present or the future. So what we have to do is disqualify all ancient, previous thought, right? It's like you can't take the founders seriously, right? They were, like, what, do you want to go back to the 50s? Like, the founders were all the way back in the 18th century, right? So that's the first part. Other parts of this new founding myth are that the New Deal ended the Great Depression. Okay, I don't know why people believe that, but I hear it all the time. That the Republicans were opposed to the Civil Rights Movement. Right, that's just flat out not true. And the Civil Rights Movement really has become the center of this myth, right? Like we could come up with examples endlessly, but the Civil Rights Movement is pretty much central, right? There has to be some belief, right? These people demand that we believe that there was something unprecedented and noble about the Civil Rights Movement, right, that suffices to reject all of previous, history or political thought, what have you. Right? I refer to what we have today as civil rights reenactment, right? When you see all these people in the streets, when you make some comment about minorities and it pisses someone off, that's because they are committed to reenacting the civil rights movement, right? It's characterized by the phrase that I mentioned earlier, what, you want to go back to the 50s, right? And but the problem is that it's somewhat anachronistic, right? Like, the civil rights movement was noble. There are certain things about it I wish might have happened differently, but, the situation for black people needed to be improved. And that was the point of it, right? So that's noble, that's great. But the thing is, in the pre-civil rights movement days, like, just to take one example, black people in a lot of places in the South were made to take impossibly difficult tests in order to vote, right? Like, I've actually looked at some of these tests, and it's not just that they're impossibly difficult, they're literally impossible. They're like nonsensical, you can't pass them. That was the obstacle to taking tests in a lot of places in the South in those days. But today, the obstacle everyone is worried about is having a voter or a photo ID, right? Voter ID laws require that you have a photo ID to vote. So that's the difference between then and now, okay? right? Like, today, we do not need to reenact the civil rights movement, or, you know, a proper way to do it would be focusing on things like telling everyone that they're a bunch of, spoiled brats who have it, better than kings and queens used to. And otherwise, that, the people that are the problem are the ones that do sketchy shit, right? Like, sketchy people bring everyone else down. So, those were not things that needed to be said in the 60s, right? But that's what needs to be said today to these civil rights reenactors. And so this new founding myth, it exists to justify this new utopian version of freedom that's unattainable, right? Like, once you get to the point where you think that it's unjust to require photo ID to vote, right? You've jumped the proverbial shark, right? Like, that's just, like, that's just ridiculous, all right? It's not a serious view, okay? There's another quick example, waterboarding, right? People get so upset about waterboarding, high value subjects for interrogation, right? I don't know where all it was done, but it was done. But they don't realize that the lawyers that signed off on the waterboarding were waterboarded to try it out, okay? Like, if we're going to use our interrogation tactics on the very people that sign off on these interrogation tactics, I think that we can go ahead and have, fine enough consciences here, right? But no, it's some big deal. Oh my gosh, waterboarding is torture. Yeah, tell that to the lawyers that we waterboarded that signed off on it. So, anyway, my point is that, take it from me, we can be honest about the historical founders and still regard them as a fine example to imitate, all right? We don't need no stinking founding myths, all right? Gosh.